Okay, let's pick up on page 84 with the Scenario Manager. The Scenario Manager that I'm going to show you how to prepare is going to be just slightly different than what our authors are illustrating. However, they are almost identical, just some small differences. Okay, so the general idea here is that you'll notice in row number 26 that we have in our example, we're budgeting for a substantial purchase of maybe some new equipment or something like that in the month of July. As a result, you can see that cumulatively in the month of July, we have to borrow up to $105,000 or a little bit more than that to facilitate this purchase. And then in the month of August, we're going to pay some of that back. Well, we might, if we could make this purchase in some other month, the question then becomes, how would that change the total amount of interest expense that we have to pay? And so let's insert a line in row 35, right click and click insert, and let's go ahead and create a row that says cumulative interest expense and hit return. And that cumulative interest expense is going to be equal to the previous month's interest plus the current month's interest. And go ahead and copy that over. So you can see in the month of July, we've borrowed 92. In the month of August, we still have this 92 that is interest expense, plus the additional 702. And then through the month of September, we have a total of $865 worth of interest expense cumulatively. Now, if we were to change this $200, say, to the month of June, what would that do to our total interest expense? I'm just going to highlight that in yellow so that it makes it a little more evident. So if instead of borrowing in July, we borrow in June, you can see our interest expense goes up. What if we borrowed in August instead? It looks like our interest expense goes down. What if we borrowed in September instead? And so in a situation like this, Excel has a program called the Scenario Manager. So rather than going through and making all these changes, we'll set up a Scenario Manager that does that for us, and it's going to spit out a report that reports the results. So let's go up to the Data tab. And in the Data tab, click on the What If Analysis and click on the Scenario Manager. Let's go ahead and click Add. And our first scenario we are going to call, it looks like, let's just call it expenditure in June. And notice that expenditure in June is illustrated in figure 3-4 on page 86. And let's click on the changing cells. The cells that are going to be changing in our scenario are the capital outlays. Hit return and click OK. And so if we make the expenditure in June, we'll spend $200,000 in June and 0 in the other months. And click return. And now let's add another scenario. Let's say expenditure in July. The changing cells are the same, so we can just hit enter, click OK, and in this case that's when our expenditure is already in our budget, so we can just leave it and click OK. Let's click add, type another expenditure in August. Changing cells are correct, so click OK. And so let's zero out the 200 in July and add 200 in the month of August. And click OK. And then let's add one more. September. And the changing cells are accurate. So notice cell E26 is the expenditure in June. or excuse me, F26, August 26. In this case, we want it to be in September, which is cell H26. Click OK. And now we have our 3 scenarios present. Let's go ahead and click Summary. And now the results cell. The results cell is actually the one that we highlighted in yellow. And based upon the changes in the capital outlays will show us what happens to the cumulative interest expense. Click OK. And here's our scenario manager. If we make the expenditure in June, total interest expense will be $1,051. If we do it in July, interest expense will be a little bit less. If we make the expenditure in August, we actually have a little bit of interest income. And therefore, if we make the expenditure in September, we even have more income. So therefore, we're reducing our expenses and actually creating a little bit of income if we make our $200,000 expenditure in the month of September versus the month of July. And that's how the scenario manager works. Oftentimes in finance, there's lots of what-if possibilities. And based on the what-if possibilities, we can use a scenario manager to analyze the potential outcome. Okay, now that I'm done with the scenario manager, I see that I have a small problem. So let's go back to sheet number 1. And on sheet number 1, my formula for the cumulative interest isn't exactly right. If I double click, notice that I take my 2 successive periods worth of interest expense. However, the cumulative interest should be equal to the interest expense, the previous cumulative interest expense, plus the current month's interest expense. And hit return. And so my cumulative interest expense is actually $957, not the previous amount. Notice now that my scenario manager is not correct. So if I right click on this tab and if I click delete, this sheet goes away. And now I can just run the scenario manager again. If I click on what if, scenario manager, click summary, everything's set to go, click OK, and now I have an updated scenario manager with the correct amounts for the various scenarios. Okay, that concludes our video once again, and we'll see you again in the next chapter.